Through time, Crescent Hill has had an enduring affinity with water. Pioneers and then gardeners were lured by its springs. The reservoir grounds have provided water as well as parkland. Its swimming pools have been a source of recreation since 1919. Its looming 240-foot water tower has been Crescent Hill's landmark since 1906.
They built the water tower in 1906 or 1907. I was about 10 years old. My brother and I went down there, and the man asked if we wanted to climb to the top. When we got back home, we were almost paddled when we told them we had climbed the water tower.
Gradually, the lake was filled with mud, cleaned from the reservoir basins, and the city's largest swimming pool was constructed on part of the site. Some 40,000 thrashing residents were entertained in just its first 6 weeks in 1919. The pool was accessible from Frankfort Avenue and sat directly below the gatehouse, which connects the huge basins. The embankment walls were constructed of earth moved from a nearby borrow pit, which became a crescent-shaped lake. Crescent Hill had already been named before the reservoir was constructed, so the familiar story of its taking its name from these man-made features is only a tale and need not be repeated. The reservoir, constructed between 1876 and 1879, was not only larger, but on higher ground than the first one the Louisville Water Company built near its Ohio River pumping station. Constructed in 1857, where the Veterans Administration Hospital is presently, it was later used by country clubs and scouts, and adventurous children knew this area as the Third Woods. Both old and new reservoir sites were features of the 1887 park system concept, which was refined and later implemented by Frederick Law Olmsted in its 1868 forerunner, which called for 3 parks connected by a boulevard to be called Crescent Avenue. Pipeline Lane, later renamed for Water Company President Sebastian Zorn, follows the initial section of the 1868 proposal for Crescent Avenue from the pumping station. It was upgraded under public works projects during the Depression.
It was a favorite place to go pick daisies. In those days, you didn't need so much to amuse you. The main entertainment on a Sunday afternoon was walking over to the daisy field.
Between 1898 and 1909, substantial improvements were made on the water company grounds south of Frankfort Avenue, which runs in front of the long shed. Rock had to be blasted to provide for underground coagulation basins. The earth, which was removed, filled an old swamp and is contained by the high wall on Stilts Avenue. Near the old Thatcher House in the background, Chautauquas, featuring entertainment and cultural programs, were held every summer between 1918 and 1926. On other parts of the reservoir grounds, popular spectator sports like baseball were played by the 1911 team and football by the Wildcats of 1925. Before water could be piped down every street, springs were the determining factors in the selection of home sites. Because of a tilt in the limestone under Crescent Hill, springs have a propensity to effuse on the southern slopes. So when roads were made along the ridgetop, houses were built between the sources of transportation and water. The 1879 atlas shows this clearly. The springs created brooks which fed Beargrass Creek, and Crescent Hill was first known as Beargrass. Stone spring houses were built to protect water sources and cool perishables. The old Reinhardt spring house, drawn by Sidney Kennedy in 1865, was typical. It sat in the vicinity of Kennedy Avenue and Grinstead Drive. Sidney Kennedy's parents were part of the new wave of professional people who took up residence in Crescent Hill after the railroad could provide commuter service. Thomas Smith Kennedy was successful in the insurance business, and in 1855, he purchased a 22-acre tract with a partially built house on it called Castle Rackrent, a title evidently inspired by a Maria Edgeworth novel. The name meant little to Kennedy, who finished the house, so being within sight of the fairgrounds across the Frankfort Turnpike, he aptly named it Fairview. By the time the fair closed, he had made the necessary improvements to rename it the Turrets. Sidney's sketchbook also contains 1865 versions of the front gate and swing house. The granddaddy of all local spring houses was connected to the circa 1780 pioneer fortification, Spring Station. A fine brick house, built by Norburn Beale after 1802, perpetuated the name Spring Station and continued to utilize the abundant water source of Beale's Branch. The Spring Station tract of 341 acres was subdivided in 1849 and 1850 into 7 parcels. The Williamsburg-inspired house has recently been renovated. More typical of the early Beargrass houses was Chatsworth, built by John Edwards about 1810. In 1866, his son sold it to Dr. Urban Epinetus Ewing. His daughter, Jenny Ewing, married George Keats Speed of the Farmington Speeds, and they divided Chatsworth in 1884, and the division line became the western boundary of Crescent Hill. An 1884 atlas shows the division line road, Ewing Avenue, curving just as it does now around Edwards Pond. Adam Butcher built his house on the Brownsboro Turnpike about 1866. He operated the ice house and employed about 50 men in the winter to cut ice off Edwards Pond. The Clifton Brewery was run by William Palmer until Prohibition and was discreetly frequented by most boys in the neighborhood. Palmer's son, Charles, later ran a saloon and grocery in Butcher's old house. More recently, it has been Min's Steakhouse. Across Brownsboro Road was the hillside home of William Coop, with gardens cascading down to a creek. The hillside is now terraced by Eagles Eyrie. Further east, overlooking Brownsboro Road, were the flower beds and greenhouses of Charles Reimers, who built a large frame house about 1888. Reimers specialized in roses, and on the first Wednesday in May, 1896, he headed out to the feature race sponsored by the Louisville Jockey Club and placed a blanket of his best Crescent Hill roses over Ben Brush's neck. After that, they changed the day of the race, but it continues to be called the Run for the Roses. Across the ravine was Repton, the finest home in Crescent Hill. It was built by Dr. Norburn Beale Galt on 555 acres he inherited in 1828. Repton had a familiar Kentucky architectural style, but its front and back galleries exhibited a Mississippi Valley influence. About the turn of the century, Repton burned and its hulk was purchased and rebuilt in the prevailing colonial revival style by the manufacturer of steam fittings, Thomas Moran. The grounds, now hidden by apartment complexes, were once planted in orchards and flower beds by Norburn Galt and his father, the renowned physician and horticulturist, Dr. William Craig Galt, whose own property was the site of the first Galt house. A creek on the south side of Brownsboro Road was put underground in 1935, and the road was widened.
They baptized in that creek. That's when Mount Nebo Baptist Church was a mission. We would play down there and swing on those beech trees. That was the happiest time of my life.
Salima Hall, another fine house overlooking land which would be divided by the Brownsboro Turnpike, was built by merchant David Chambers on ground he purchased in 1838. Much of the central part of Crescent Hill was owned by siblings of Zachary Taylor. His sister, Elizabeth, lived at Beachland, a two-story log and clapboard house which was cut down and later used as servants' quarters. It was in this structure in 1835 that the future president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, married Sarah Knox Taylor, daughter of the future President of the United States. Andrew Zender built the brick house on Rebel Road in its stead about 1870. The road through the ridge of Crescent Hill is as old as it was necessary for pioneers to travel between the outposts at the falls of the Ohio and the Bluegrass. It was well trod by the likes of Clark and Boone for 70 years before being paralleled by the tracks of the Louisville and Frankfort Railroad. The locomotives and baggage cars of the 1850s were hardly sophisticated, but they changed the face of Louisville's first railroad suburb. The trains could move garden produce and commuters who had been accustomed to only 1 or 2 horsepower. The railroad made a suburban fairgrounds possible. Beginning in 1853, thousands of people could be transported daily to the grounds of the Southwestern Agricultural and Mechanical Association. The entrance towers, which spanned Crescent Avenue, were later made into a residence. State fairs were held in Crescent Hill in 1858, 1863, 1865, and 1867. But the first national fair in the South and West was the most memorable. The facilities in 1857 included an amphitheater that could seat 10,000, an area for mechanical and power equipment, and a floral hall. Floral Hall was in the background when the Commonwealth of Kentucky set up a training camp for militia officers in August 1860. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper had accurately depicted Camp Boone, as this series of photographs confirms. The week at Camp Boone was as much a training session as a social engagement, capped off by the governor's review and a dance in Floral Hall, hardly a prelude to the Civil War. 2 years later, Union soldiers bivouacked at the fairgrounds were being a nuisance to apprehensive neighbors who were a pocket of Confederate sympathy and support. Any Underground Railroad activity in Crescent Hill is a tunnel of the imagination. Cora Owens lived across from the reservoir at Villa Ridge, later known as the Lower Crab House. This 14-year-old observer kept a journal which displayed the neighborhood's colors.
September 20th, 1862. The retreating soldiers from Richmond, Kentucky, ran over everybody about here. We fed about 200 of them. They were nearly famished for water. I felt so sorry for them. They seemed a great many of them to be tired of the war. These Yanks say that our men are ragged and barefooted, but I hope it's not so. But if it is, it only shows how determined and devoted our men are. Oh, I'm so proud of our Army.
The Union troops wore out their welcome as well as the fairgrounds. Its ownership was reorganized and the grounds refurbished, but it was never able to regain its former popularity. In 1875, the 42 acres became Fairview, Crescent Hill's first subdivision of building lots. The fair structures were torn down and replaced by houses. At the head of Fairview Avenue, now Crescent Avenue, is the Italianate house built by the mill furnishings dealer Jonathan C. Wright about 1878. Jurist Emmett Field bought the house in 1890. Mrs. Field was part of Crescent Hill's power structure. 2 other houses on Crescent Avenue date to the early subdivision. The frame house of Sam English is obscured by a hedge at English Avenue. That of Thomas Truman was at Field, where the Howe family later ran a boarding house and trained horses in the back. It was replaced by a fine brick home. Nearby lived one of Crescent Hill's several doctors. Dr. Frank Kiefer moved in 1898, and the fact was chiseled into the entranceway by a German stonemason who traded his skill for a $100 doctor's bill. The wall's cement balls attracted much attention from pranksters, as Dr. Kiefer's son, Carey, sitting on the wall, would later say, Boy, when Halloween came around in those early days, it was hell. The other stone walls in Crescent Hill defined the entrances to subdivisions that followed Fairview, like Bellevue in 1899, that became Crescent Court, Willowbrook, which became Birchwood in 1901, and Eastover Park in 1907. There are 20-some major subdivisions in Crescent Hill.
It was a small town. You might not know everybody, but at least you knew who everybody was or something about them. It was sort of a homogeneous community, although there were different areas that were a little more homogeneous than others. Crescent Hill took pride in being Crescent Hill.
Subdivisions provided building lots, and the housing stock increased dramatically between 1890 and 1920. Architecture changed too. The Williams home on Fenley Avenue is typical of the late Georgian style of 1846. The 1850 Greek Revival home of the Reverend James Craik on Lexington Road. Judge Henry J. Stites' Roman Revival home of the 1850s, also on Lexington Road. The Isaac Hyatt home on Penwood, also of the late 1850s. Valentine Frank put his initials in his mansard roof in the late 1860s. Joseph Peterson's Italianate Villa summer home of 1869. The Archibald Cochran home in Cherokee Park of about 1870. Mrs. Casper Murky's Queen Anne home on North Height of 1893. The stylish bungalow of Oscar Farmer on Crescent Avenue of 1910. The greatest influx of people into Crescent Hill was likewise between 1890 and 1920. The availability of transportation spurred Louisville's first railroad and mule car suburb. The train was augmented by mule cars in the 1880s. They trudged along the south side of Frankfort Avenue until 1901, when they were replaced by electric trolleys and interurbans. The railroad would bring the likes of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, who detrained at Crescent Avenue and were driven into town. In 1915, the Liberty Bell passed through to the cheers of school children lining the tracks. And then there were the troop trains.
They hauled these boys out here by the carloads. Some didn't look much older than I did. We were little fellas, and we'd run down to where the railroad crossed Frankfort Avenue, and they'd reach their hands out, grab us, and pull us in the window. We'd ride beyond Crescent Hill. That was, to me, one of the highlights of my life, riding in the train with the soldiers.
The man most recognized in these parts by presidents and residents alike was John Lee Wilson, a popular gatekeeper at Crescent Avenue. Pap, as he was known, with Hugh Hunter leaning on him, was also certified mayor of Crescent Hill for life by the mayor of Louisville. But perhaps his acknowledgement by President Woodrow Wilson meant as much. Some say Woodrow Wilson made a big mistake marrying for a second time. Edith Bowling Galt Wilson wasn't related to any of the Crescent Hill Galts, but her brother Dr. Bowling lived in Forest Court. One day, Pap Wilson received word that he should be on the lookout for the afternoon C&O. Pap told just a few people. As the C&O pulled the grade through Crescent Hill, there was a crowd surrounding his guardhouse. On the back deck of the train was President Wilson, who tipped his hat and called to his proud namesake, "Hi, Pap." An indication of residential development can be seen in the formation of neighborhood churches. Some held services in the county schoolhouse before it was converted into the Christian church in 1907. It also served as the town hall and frequently as a dance hall.
One time, Father and Uncle George got a cow and put it up in the belfry of the Christian church. It was a white wood church then. They had a great time painting the cow first.
They had on Sunday afternoons a neighborhood sort of prayer meeting, and Grandpa Kennedy had an organ they would put in the back of the carriage and take over there The whole neighborhood came. Later on, some of the people wanted their own churches.
The Methodists built on the south side of Frankfort Avenue, east of Ewing, in 1890. The Presbyterians immediately followed with a wood and frame version, which now has a stone front. In 1895, the Episcopalians erected what was touted as the smallest church in the world. Next door on Frankfort Avenue, Brenton Davis designed a brick edifice for the Baptists in the classical revival style of 1911. The Baptist Church in Crescent Hill became a drawing card for the seminary, which moved from downtown to among the daisies of Lexington Road in 1926. The seminary site was called the Beeches, and before that, Bird's Nest, it being the clapboard manor house built by Hampton Zane in 1854. The gardens of a subsequent owner, Rudolph Fink, were quite elaborate. Cozy Lodge next door was also purchased by the seminary. Part of the Metis's farm pasture had been sold off for houses, accessible by a road which was the continuation of Birchwood as it crossed Daisy Lane, now Grinstead. What had been a bucolic pastoral place at the turn of the century was altered by people and the automobile. Dusty roads were made, and home delivery brought items once produced in backyard pastures. And with the new residents came hordes of kids to be educated and entertained.
Crescent Hill was the outstanding place to be born and raised in.
The Crescent Hill Club was built in 1902 on Stilts Lane with facilities for billiards, pool, and dancing. It was superseded by the St. Mark's Men's Club. And then there was miniature golf at Grinstead and Lexington Road beside the distillery. In the earliest days, kids' education was a family responsibility, like the Old Spring Station School where Emmett Field School is today. The longest continuing school in Crescent Hill is Sacred Heart Academy, which began in 1877. The two-room schoolhouse on Crescent Avenue was replaced by 8 rooms on Payne Street in 1905, named to honor George Rogers Clark, who had probably passed within a block of that site on his way to Harrodsburg. 10 years later, the Emmett Field School was needed. The Crescent Hill Junior High School of the 30s was renamed in honor of another judge, Alex G. Barrett. The Carnegie Branch Library has been the center of cultural activities since 1908. For 30 years, its librarian, Sally Berryman, was the guiding light for most neighborhood children. She not only supervised what they read, but she established clubs and athletic teams of one kind or another to develop academic and social skills and to sap adolescent energies. The boys also socialized on the corner of Frankfort and Bailey, where Ed Hinkebine had his drugstore for years. The girls would rather be on the second floor taking dancing lessons from the elegant Mamie Wastel. The boys could have cared less. Most of the needs of the neighborhood were readily available. The post office and a grocery were on Crescent Avenue.
We liked what we had in Crescent Hill. We didn't have all the fine houses, but we had everything that was necessary. The children didn't have to go anywhere else to play. We had stores as good as you could find. What more could you want?
Bollinger had a drugstore near Stilts. Will Hartmetz's hardware store was an institution. John Frank's Grocery and sometime Opera House, later Canup and Hudson, was on the corner of Frank Avenue before it was shoved back to make way for a Stall oil station.
Every night at 8 o'clock, the bells would ring, the horses were in their stalls. The doors would fly open and the horses would run up and stand in position, and they would drop the harness on them. They would stand there for about a minute. The bells would ring again and the harness would go up. The horses would go back and get a drink. Then they would spend the night chewing on hay and waiting for a fire.
Shikes was a wonderful place. They made the most divine chocolate kuchen. It was a rectangular slab for a nickel, or much bigger for a dime. Pocketbook rolls were delivered on Saturday afternoon, and they made a marvelous Charlotte Russe, too.
In the memories of those who grew up in Crescent Hill, it was a very distinctive place.
This Crescent Hill business is really something we die with. No one else can understand it.
It was a unique place. There's no question about it.